Good to see everyone. Glad you're here. And I'll begin with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious and Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of this day, the call of God's people to gather in your name to share the word, a life-giving word that gives hope for the people. May we learn new truths about that word this day and be willing to share that to a world outside who desperately needs to hear it. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. Well, let me just, while we're getting settled, check in with you all to see if there's any thoughts you have, any questions. Okay. If you wouldn't mind just I wanted to do this at the very beginning so I won't forget. You'll see kind of where we're going today with the first book of the first Isaiah, but at the very bottom you'll see our next meeting won't be next week, but it'll be in 2 weeks. And the reason next week I won't be here, Mark and I are going to New York for about 5 days for a family wedding and to see the new grandchild too. So we will regather in 2 weeks and we'll look at first Isaiah's contemporary Micah. Next time we're together. Micah and Isaiah, first Isaiah, and I'll in a minute explain first, second, and third Isaiah, but Micah and first Isaiah are contemporaries. And so they'll often be linked together because of that. But they have a kind of a unique position in the sense that they lived and prophesied during that crucial period between the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 BC, between that date and the fall of the south, the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC. So that 150-year period was an important period. And that's where Isaiah and Micah lived and prophesied. So that's why they're often linked together. And now the book of Isaiah, real quick, it's a huge book. And for that and other reasons, it's one of our favorites. As we're about to see today, it's a very poetic book. Isaiah was an incredible theologian, scholar, prophet. And when we talk about the book of Isaiah, we're essentially talking about three different people, three different authors. First Isaiah, sometimes called Isaiah of Jerusalem, is what you'll find in chapters 1 through 39 of the book of Isaiah. Second Isaiah is sometimes called Deutero-Isaiah, is a different person, and his chapters are chapter 40 to chapter 55 of the book of Isaiah. And then third Isaiah is chapters 56 to 66. So they're really three different people. Third Isaiah probably was a friend, a colleague, a disciple of second Isaiah. But today, for the purposes of our time together here, we're just going to look at first Isaiah, or sometimes called Isaiah of Jerusalem. And like I mentioned, he lived in the 7th century, and we know enough about him to kind of fill out that biography. He was the son of Amoz. Isaiah spent his entire life in Jerusalem. It was a city that he knew well. It was a city he dearly loved. It was a city that he called affectionately David's city. It was, of course, at that time, an important city. It was the home of God's temple. The temple that Solomon built was still around, and it was the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was located. And because of these factors, his stream of messianic theology is seen throughout. And that's really a reason why we have so much affection for Isaiah, because a lot of the scriptures we read in Advent and in Christmas come from this book, and they talk about the coming of the Messiah. Now later on we'll talk about, as Christians, we view that Messiah differently than Isaiah of Jerusalem would have, but nevertheless, It's a very, and the scriptures I've chosen today are all familiar. And we'll see as we go, how Christians took this scripture and looked at it, from the Christian point of view. We know that Isaiah of Jerusalem was very well educated. In fact, many of his writings survive. Some of the book of Isaiah, I think the first and second parts of Isaiah, survived in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were founded in Israel in 1948. And that perfectly hermetically sealed scrolls that I had a chance to visit. When the scrolls made a tour in Houston about 15 years ago, I went down to the museum to see it, and it was very meaningful to me to actually see the scrolls that would have been centuries and centuries old that someone wrote of Isaiah's passage. We know that Isaiah was very wealthy, that he grew up and lived in the temple court. He knew all of the kings during his lifetime. He was the consummate insider. And as I mentioned, he was a contemporary of Micah, and much like the two prophets we looked at last week, Hosea and Amos, he also had a stream of preaching against social injustice. He saw that as a problem in the society in which he lived. He preached, like Amos and Hosea, against religious syncretism. That's the idea that kind of you pick and choose what parts of the spirituality you want. No. He saw that as a spiritual decay, and he preached against syncretism. Yes.
Would you say that word?
So
spell that word?
Syncretism is SYNCRETISM. I was mentioning last week the word synergy is similar. You know how synergy we use in a positive way to get our energy from different sources. The problem with syncretism, though, is that it will use New Age or any strange and nefarious methods to, quote unquote, get you to the truth. During this time, the primary threat was Baalism and the different sets of gods. What we know about the Assyrians from the north and the Babylonians from the south is that when part of their danger in defeating Israel was they believed in the syncretism. They had their own set of gods, their own priests, their own temples, their own beliefs that were the exact opposite of the monotheistic Yahweh, God of Israel. So in every way possible, they were on the other end of the spectrum, okay? Isaiah saw and preached that the spiritual foundations of the nation of Israel were weak. And he calls for a whole new renewal in the land. And I love this phrase I came across that describes the moment. He was, I forgot who said it, but it was as if a new occupant had moved into Yahweh's house, a counterfeit God. Now, how would you feel if on Monday a whole new religious system came in and took over St. Luke's on the Lake? You would be outraged. Your breath would be taken away. You would be without a foundation. Just think about that. You see, that's what was going on. And that's what was about to happen. And Isaiah has a task before him, does he not? Doubts began to arise among the people if Yahweh, this God that they worshipped for so long, even had the power anymore to fulfill the vision of the covenant. And when that happens among the people, unfaith begins to rise. The king at the time, Ahaz, a different Ahaz than Ahaz and Jezebel from Ezekiel days, King Ahaz saw himself that there was no way to save Judah. So he began to make submissions and compromises to the kings around him. And of course, all that does is lead to more misery, more unfaith. So thankfully, we have Isaiah, who will speak the truth. Isaiah enters the scene. He is at the age of 25 years old. And we're about to find out his calling. He's 25 years old in the year that King Uzziah died. And he will be around, Isaiah, for the next 50 years, becoming the absolute single major force of good in his country. He would be influential over the people. Isaiah would be influential over the kings. He would guide the nation through a series of crises, just like Churchill did and FDR did in the Second World War. Think about that kind of leadership that Isaiah was providing. Isaiah was considered royalty, even though for most of his life he preached often against the court and against its policies. So let's go right into the scriptures. And the place to begin always with Isaiah is his calling. Now, before I read this, I want you to know that this is almost always read at an ordination of a priest. And I think, Martha, wasn't this the passage you read at my ordination? We were engaged at the time. I think it was. I didn't look. It was a while ago. And so this is often read, Isaiah. So I'm going to look at the calling of Isaiah, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, and then I'm going to go into a little bit of detail. It's a very important passage.
How was he called? Did God come in a cloud?
We're about to find out. We're right here. I'm glad you asked. You can hardly wait. It's the details. It's the details, Francis. In the year that King Uzziah died, I, Isaiah, saw the Lord sitting upon the throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphim to me, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin forgiven. And I, Isaiah, heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. So the place of this vision, this calling, this ordination, was, of course, the Temple of Solomon. The vision opens with God sitting on his high throne, Yahweh, and saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord. When we look at this service, it is a temple service that we see recreated again and again in the book of Revelation. Lots of the same pieces are there. Isaiah himself, the one who's to be ordained, is standing in the temple. And the radiance of God not just fills the room, the court, but the whole earth. And it is Yahweh, it is God, not King Uzziah or any king, who is the real king. And it is his sovereignty that's determining everyone's destiny. Even where we know that the temple priests who are there are transfigured. There are also present heavenly seraphims. Seraphims meaning half human, half animal. And note, if you will, the three pairs of wings. One pair, this is in verse 2, one pair is covering his face, one pair is covering his feet, and the third pair fly to their appointed place. Now, why is this detail going on? It is going on because this is Isaiah's picture of the most overpowering, awesome effect of who God is. Smoke filled the temple, incense filled the temple. And so the prophet enters the vestibule, the temple, and he stands in the Holy of Holies, in God's celestial room, where the other heavenly hosts are surrounding the king. And Isaiah's first response is in verse 5, where he cries out that he is an unclean man versus the holiness of God. That's what he's trying to compare. Look at verse 5. And I said to him, woe is me, for I am lost. I am not worthy for this. I am a simple man. I am one of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a lot of people who have unclean lips. But my eyes have seen the Lord, the King of Kings. So there's this wonderful juxtaposition about the unworthiness, the crying out from an unclean man versus the absolute holiness of God. And I love how Isaiah confesses that not only is he a man who is unclean, but he represents a people, the nation of Judah, who are also unclean. And then in the next verse, verse 6, then flew one of the seraphims to me, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is now taken away and your sin forgiven. That idea of a red-hot stone that purges unclean lips. In other words, the prophet knows and understands that there has to be a purification before he can dare be God's messenger, a prophet. And thus, in a very powerful scene, begins the career, a long career, of Isaiah of Jerusalem. And one of the things that we want to look at, I think, that's important for us as Christians today when we read a scene like this and other scenes, is to understand both what I call the transcendence and the immanence of God. What I mean by that is the transcendence is God transcends us. He is in charge of this scene in every verse. He is greater than the sum total of all the parts. God is God and we are not. And yet, at the same time, this God who is omnipresent, who is transcendent, is also God that we can reach. He's our companion. He's our friend. We go to Jesus whenever we need him. Don't hesitate. He knows every hair on our body. Do you see the wonderful sort of double nature of our God, who's transcendent, but yet he's also immanent? And we never want to forget that about who our God is. That's the character and the nature of God. And this is a wonderful scene that gives us an account of both of those great features, I think. I hope you see that. You know, either way, after you read this passage, you kind of want to sit down and have a cigarette, don't you? It's like, wow, this is really something. Yes.
One of the most dramatic anthems I ever was privileged to sing was by a fellow, I think David McKay Williams is his name. It's probably written in the 1950s.
Oh.
And it's titled "In the Year King Uzziah Died."
Oh,
And it's very Cecil B. DeMille, loud and then very soft and eerie. And it is a wonderful piece of music, and I'm sure you can find it if you want it on YouTube.
We need to have Don Grantham write that from this verse, and if he hasn't already, probably has. That's your assignment. Give this to Don Grant. Thank you for that. Yes.
Well, just like Moses in the burning bush, we don't
Yes.
see that his mouth is damaged. It's just, and the other thing is, I don't know how many times, I don't think many times do we see in the Old Testament, your guilt is taken away, your sin away. That is a New Testament.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, this is.
And then God would let Ezekiel speak
Mm-hmm.
after this.
Mm-hmm. Right.
deal.
Right.
I
And
believe I knew that.
but you all are all right on target to equate this scene with the calling of Moses, the calling of Ezekiel, the calling of David. All this is in line with all of that. It's a very important passage. But I also, you can see why, as Christians, these are really important passages that point to the New Testament as well. Isaiah's love of the house of David should go mentioned as something that Jesus is from that same lineage as well. All of these have connections. Okay.
In the words of Samuel, here I am.
Yes. Exactly.
That's where we heard it.
It is, yeah, and more to follow. Exactly. One of my favorite passages, and I have many in the book of Isaiah, is the next passage called the Song of the Vineyard. And here we see a couple of things. One is a beautifully written. It's almost like a song. You would sing it. It's certainly poetic. It's a didactic poem. And also it introduces, and I'll tell you at the very end what it introduces, but it introduces what's called a covenant lawsuit. And this is a different relationship that God has with God's people in terms of the covenant. It's from now on, we are going to make this covenant relationship more formal, more like a lawsuit where there are boundaries, where there are rules to follow, where there are consequences if you don't, okay? So we'll get into that as well, just to kind of preview. Let me read Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 7, and then again, like the other passage, we'll revisit a few verses. This is Isaiah speaking until the 7th verse. Verses 1 through 6 is Isaiah. Verse 7 is actually Yahweh speaking. Let me sing for my beloved a love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He digged it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. Okay, now, the speaker changes to God. God says, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold a cry. This verse is God interpreting what Isaiah has done. So let's look at this a little more closely. This is Isaiah's first sort of message, if you will, to a people who he saw, rightly so, as completely incapable of correction. incapable of accepting a new way. He thought, rightly so, that they were beyond hope, beyond repair. And so he uses a very powerful imagery to discuss that view he has. The nation of Israel had everything going for it. It was a well-tended vineyard. It was such a good vineyard that it ought to have produced some good grapes, but it did not because of its unfaithfulness, right? Thus, Judah, because of her failure to respond to God with righteous behavior, will now have to be turned over, tilled again, because it's a useless vineyard. It's now full of briars and thorns. Okay, do you see that, right? And so if we look more closely at this poem, it's literally singing a song. It talks about Isaiah's disappointment and that the harvest did not yield good grapes when it had everything going for it. Look with me again at verse 4. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, and why did it yield wild grapes, meaning useless grapes? In other words, what went wrong here? Hearers, come on, tell me what we could have done better, but we didn't. And so, with those rhetorical questions, he then decides a pretty radical response in verse 5. That's the way I look at it in verse 5, where he says, I know what I will do. I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. We're going to start all over. I will remove its edge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. In other words, we're going to tear down these vines and start over, and hopefully this vineyard will become a better path for righteousness, for justice, for the future. Okay? And then, as I mentioned in verse 7, the speaker changes from the prophet Isaiah to God, and he talks about the people's heart. God still has this covenant that he believes will work. He has to believe it will work. He has not given up on his people. And so he announces what scholarship has called a covenant lawsuit against a people who must stand trial before the judge for all they've done. And it's important for us to remember that this is not a call for destruction. That will never happen. But it is a call for punishment to fit the crime in hopes of serving the king in a fresh way. Verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah, that's Jerusalem, the southern kingdom. The men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked with justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold the cry. So it's a very unique and different way to reset the covenant by introducing this idea of a lawsuit, if you will. Just a brief history here, and then I'll pause and we can ask questions or discuss some more. We look at this song of the vineyard, and we see it as the absolute perfect song for the nation at the time. Isaiah prophesied, again correctly, that the nation was about to crumble, and it would be reduced to a very tiny remnant. Just a few faithful would remain. And he is saying that this idea of a covenant is the most helpful way I can get them through it. He's preaching still that God is still in control, and that God will set up a vision of a peaceful kingdom later on, which we're about to read. Therefore, in Isaiah's mind and in God's mind, this present crisis would become part of a much larger purpose. It would be a purge, essentially, by which God would remove the dross and be left with a purified, chastened people. Eventually, it was Isaiah who would be the first one to give up on this King Ahaz. He is useless here. He does not get it. He will never get it. He is not a king that we can trust. But thankfully, there will be a great king that comes after him, and that is Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was truly one of the great kings of Israel during this time. If you were to go to Jerusalem today, you would see signs of Hezekiah's tunnel, which survived all this time. But Hezekiah was truly a reformer, and he and Isaiah would be best buds for like 20 years. He ruled all the way until 680A, and that's essentially the last time we would hear from the prophet Isaiah. Hezekiah would stand tall as the successor to Ahaz. His city would not fall from the Assyrians. He would have such effective defense that they would not advance. Now, 100 years later, long after Hezekiah, the Babylonians would do them in, but not the Assyrians from the north. And it was this new king that Isaiah and mentored, and Isaiah prophesied and propped up that would be the answer to this Song of the Vineyard. Okay? So, whenever you feel that there's no hope, that we are a nation or a church that is in need of desperation, of help, turn to this Song of the Vineyard. Okay, turn to this. This is a great, it's realistic, it's hopeful, it talks to the present, but it also talks to the future. And that, to me, is pure Old Testament prophecy at its best, having that transcending time. Okay? Any thoughts about the Song of the Vineyard? I know you've read it before, seen it.
It sure sounds like a pronouncement of destruction.
Yes.
Tearing down the walls and just letting it go to seed. So where does the language come in about preserving for myself a remnant in? And I'm remembering this from somewhere, and I don't know where.
I think verse.
I think it's good we learn the history about this because it enriches what we're reading. We just read it out of the blue and think, oh, well, he had a heck of a time trying to grow those grapes. and then
I'm wondering where the guy is that was the dresser of sycamore trees from last week.
Well, I think the shift from doom and destruction to hope for the future is in the survival of Israel. Even verse 7, when God is the speaker, not Isaiah, there is the end is not there. God is not saying in any way, I've given up, I'm going to walk away because you've walked away. Yes, you've walked away, but I'm not. He still feels that a good, fruitful vineyard can be planted. He still feels that there can be justice. God still feels that there is a call to righteousness. And indeed, with King Ahaz out of the way, replaced by Hezekiah, that proved to be the case.
there's Hezekiah.
Yes.
But you're right, the hope part of it. I mean, all that happened to these people. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And then, you know, they were able to stand. And it's happened again and again.
Right.
And God is all over it.
I mean, I mean, you could replace God, Jesus for Yahweh here, and the people of Israel for the Pharisees. You know, I mean, you can. There's much of the same message. You know, when you're blinded spiritually, it's going to have an impact on everything. When we look at the book of Isaiah, I think sometimes the messianic prophecy, by that I mean the coming of the Messiah for Isaiah, the coming of Jesus for Christians, is really expressed meaningfully during this time of Christmas in these next several passages. So I wanted to include two passages from chapter 7 and chapter 9. We read them on Christmas. Chapter 7, verses 14 to 17, and then I'll go right into Isaiah 9 as well. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For behold, before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in, dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. Now let's skip down to chapter 9. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. Thou hast multiplied the nation, thou hast increased its joy. They rejoice before thee as with joy at the harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff before his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, thou hast broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it, to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So when we read this and we see immediately there's all kinds of signs and symbols here. And we as Christians take that and interpret that to be, of course, the birth of Jesus. But I want us to really be careful here, because much like the Exodus tradition with Moses or the New Testament tradition with Jesus, Isaiah, when he talks about signs and performing signs, he does not mean signs to be standing by themselves, but rather they must closely be linked to the prophetic word. And what I mean by that is a sign makes true the prophecy that's been spoken. So, for Isaiah, the sign was a reminder that God was with us. Despite all the problems in the vineyard, God has not forgotten us. God is with us. He is transcendent and he is immanent both. Isaiah believed that while the people could not hear directly from God and probably couldn't see the signs of his activity, he was still going to reach out in any way he could. And Isaiah saw that as his ministry, to do whatever it took to get the people to understand, talking to them, sending them a sign, clearing out their vineyard, you name it. And so Isaiah today, in these passages, gives a very clear sign. And the sign was there was the promise of a child whose name would be Emmanuel, which of course in Hebrew is God with us. And of course, you and I have just read this with our eyes, and we know that we as Christians will add to this story. But for Isaiah, for purposes right now, it is a different story. The sign is not the child, the sign is the child himself, not necessarily the manner of his birth, but also a child that would come from a particular clan, the family of David. The child will live in a time of woe, a time of great oppression. This child will share in the suffering. And once the Assyrians clear out, this child will rule. So the messianic, which means one who rules, is what is on Isaiah's mind. Isaiah's prophecy, of course, you and I, and we have, reinterpreted in our Christian tradition. It's a wonderful passage, both for its how it stands in the New Testament and how Isaiah was using it, but also it's central to our Christian belief, the birth of Jesus. And we cannot not have this passage, you see, in our tradition. Otherwise, it makes no sense. So when we think, as we have been in this class, about how does this Old Testament passage interpret or needs to be reinterpreted for us Christians, here's a wonderful example of that. Our story begins in many ways here, according to Matthew and Luke at least. Any thoughts?
Father Mike,
Yes.
those with the some name is Messiah,
Yes. Yes.
This is
That's right.
all the virgins shall conceive and bear
That's right. This came first. Handle was second.
And also the next section, the people who walk in darkness.
Yeah. And it is. And it's amazing how in many other places Handel uses the book of Isaiah, not just here, exactly. He uses second Isaiah a lot too. But I always like to remind people that Isaiah came first, not Handel.
But what I enjoy is singing.
Yes.
It's a biblical reference.
Yes.
To the top of the piece and symbolism goes up.
Oh, gosh, I know. He was inspired, though.
Yeah.
My goodness.
It's sort of like, I'm always amazed at how often the the Bible quotes the prayer book.
Yeah. Same thing. Yeah. Martha said how the Bible quotes the prayer too. Speaking of which, a reinterpretation or interpretation, this next passage I want to go to also is very important in many ways for us Christians. It's the vision that Isaiah has, and when we read some of these passages, we get a sense of just how exquisite of a writer Isaiah of Jerusalem was. But look at this beautiful vision of a peaceable kingdom. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. And the Spirit, of course, Jesse is the father of David, we remember that. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Righteousness shall be the girdle of his waist, and faithfulness the girdle of his loins. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall feed, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The sucking child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. There are a couple of things two things at least, I want to draw our attention to this text. And then you all might have comments as well. I'd like to hear them. The first is that that when we look at this, someone has said, God does not change the behavior of the wolf or the calf or any of the animals, but rather God transforms them into a community. And so that says to me, okay, this community, this vision of a community of a peaceful kingdom, and prophets have always used that vision, that illustration. What does that look like under a Messiah's reign? What does that look like individually to us? What does it look like corporately to us? I'm thinking of some of the stirring words of our preachers, of our politicians, of our leaders. That vision, they all create a community that does not have divisions that are economic or racial, but one where there's a fellowship and a brotherhood of love. And that's what you see the behavior in this particular vision. I think that's something to ponder on. It's a beautiful biblical illustration that has found momentum in many other arenas of our lives. That's kind of what I wanted to say. Any thoughts about this passage? It's again a beautiful poetry. You can almost sing it. That's why Handel would have been drawn to these passages, because they just have they're poetic in how they're spoken, I think. Let's now we have to probably end with nitty-gritty here. And I say that because it's nitty-gritty in terms of the task that Isaiah had. Isaiah was plenty upset with his fellow people. And he has to do the hard work of prophesying and speaking the truth in love. And I didn't want us to leave first Isaiah without talking about such a passage. I'm just going to preview it by having us remind ourselves that all of the prophets had that fine line, that delicate balance between here's what's going on the ground, here's how we're unfaithful, here's how we've lost our way, here's how we are not following justice, here's how we've lost our righteousness. Balance that with the faithful remnant. There are some among us who are doing what God needs for them to do. There is hope for the future. There is renewal that will take place. So we've seen all of the prophets give that balance. And here is a very unique way that Isaiah does that same thing when he introduces us to some new language. He talks about the strange and alien of us. Martin Luther will reinterpret this passage to mean God's right hand and God's left hand. Let's get into it. The last text today, chapter 28, verses 14 to 22. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers, who rule this people of Jerusalem. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have an agreement. Another word for Hades. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, it will not come to us. For we have made lies our refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am laying in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. He who believes will not be in haste, and I will make justice the line, and righteousness the plummet, and hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and waters will overwhelm the shelter. Then your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, you will be beaten down by it. As often as it passes through, it will take you. For morning by morning it will pass through by day and night. And it will be sheer terror to understand the message. For the bed is too short to stretch oneself on it, and the covering too narrow to wrap oneself in it. Now these next passages are really important. For the Lord will rise up as on Mount Perazim. He will be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon. To do his deed, strange is his deed, and to work his work. Alien is his work. Now therefore do not scoff, lest your bonds be made strong. For I have heard a decree of destruction from the Lord of God of hosts upon the whole land. So in this great time of unease that Isaiah cannot exempt himself the truth and has to tell them, there is also this incredible assurance. The first assurance we see is in verse 16. Therefore says the Lord God, behold, I am laying in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. He who believes will not be in haste. Where have we heard this before? The New Testament, right? Jesus Christ is this cornerstone. Right, exactly. Peter and Paul said the exact same thing. So this becomes really something for us to rely on in a crisis, in a division, whatever it might be, that, wait a minute, there's still that cornerstone. I love how at St. Richard's, they have right, as you enter the church to the right, they have a marking of their cornerstone. And their cornerstone, the first brick that was laid in their church was on, you ready for this date, July the 4th, 1976, our bicentennial. So, but I love when churches have that, that cornerstone to remind ourselves, okay, it's real important. To me, I'm fascinated by strange is, in verse 21, strange is his deed, alien is his work. Those are some different words. What is this alien work, this strange work that God is doing? Well, to begin with, he's certainly calling for the humility of the people. He is calling for the people of Judah to exhibit some humility so that they can hear, so that they can understand. But isn't he also talking about this idea of judging and wrath, but also giving hope for the future and redemption for the remnant? Martin Luther came up with a phrase that I think a lot of people have been blessed by. I know I have been when he introduced it years ago, when he talked about the left hand of God and the right hand of God. The left hand of God is doing what God wishes he didn't have to do, but knows he must do. And that is to pronounce judgment. And in some cases, to deliver wrath. But what he would much rather do is use his right hand. A right hand that gives hope to the hopeful, that blesses the remnant, that speaks of renewal, that speaks of the future. We will not always be under Ahaz. Thankfully, there will be Hezekiahs. And I think that's helpful when we look at this strange work, this alien work that this God of mercy, this God of love, this God of hope, this God of a peaceable kingdom wants to do that. But he also, because of his nature and his love of us, really, has to do the left-hand work too. So just think about that left hand and that right hand as being, not opposite one another, but the necessary part of the whole body that has to be spoken. That's how I see it. And I wanted to include chapter 28, and you could read into chapter 29 if you had more time, and we see a little bit of this left hand and this right hand working. Because that's, and Isaiah, as a faithful prophet, speaks to both. Okay? So Nancy, I think you had stepped out of the room. We won't meet next week, but in 2 weeks we'll regather for Micah. Thank you. Go in peace.